Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to talk about something interesting. I want to talk about the Zimaboard. Now, some of you may have heard about this. Indeed, if you're the sort of person that has a distinct memory somewhere in your past of sitting on the floor with a PC case open, trying to piece everything together and hoping beyond measure, beyond hope, that when you press that power button on, that Windows 98 or 95 would have clicked into place and worked, this is going to sound super interesting to you, because although we have talked a lot recently about open source software, about building your own NAS, about building your own hardware from scratch, and this big area that is growing all the time between turnkey solutions that are ready to go out of the box for software included and software solutions that are open source that arrive with DIY that you've got to build from the ground up. This middle area that is extending and growing constantly, particularly when people are watching the old spending, this is where the Zimaboard comes in. This is a single board mini computer, but it's also a hackable single board server system. It is one single board that you can expand upon in so many different ways. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at the hardware, looking at the software, figuring out where it lives in this wider spectrum of the market, with NAS and Raspberry Pis knocking around all over the place and mini PCs coming out our elbows. But today we want to look at, is this a great purchase for people beyond the little tinkerer, beyond the person as a DIY hobbyist project? Because on the face of it, as cool as this system sounds, as we're going to go throughout this video, time bar along the bottom, I will highlight that this is something that is predominantly going to be targeted towards those that like to tinker around, or like to play around with their equipment, but it has a certain amount of potential where it can be more than that. So you've got to look at this video today with those two different mindsets. But let's carry on straight away. The Zimaboard, this is the 8.3.2 version of this. There's actually 3 different versions available. And the first thing that will strike you about it, as we remove that plastic there, is that the system arrives at about $100. I think about $119, including tax. And if you want to go for the most spec'd out version, that arrives with 32 gig of memory and a better CPU inside. Before we start unboxing this though, a little bit of housekeeping there. This is the 8.3.2 version. There are 3 different versions currently available. It originally started as a Kickstarter, and the lowest spec version knocking around for about $110 to $119. The odd little promo floating around. That one arrives with a dual core Intel CPU inside and 2 gig of memory. If you go for the full spec version, the 8.3.2 here, that is $199, and for that you get 8 gig of internal memory and a quad core Intel processor inside. We'll talk more about the specifications later on, but it's nice to know that the difference between the lowest and the high spec there is around about $80 top end. So again, work that in your local currency, it's actually not that much. Now, originally started on Kickstarter there, it did spectacularly well. I think it was 2.4 million Hong Kong dollars, something like a quarter to, getting the area of about 300,000 pounds of dollars. It's now available on everything. It's on your Amazons, it's on their own website, it's on all the usual retailers out there, and indeed that price point is fairly consistent across all of those platforms. There are areas of upgradability beyond that of the initial hardware that you get with it. I will say, as we go through this, that hardware upgradability does differ in some areas more than others, more on that later on. But let's go ahead with our presentation. There's our nice snazzy little box. The version I've got here also arrives with an external PSU as well. You're pretty much going to need that, to be honest, but it is included. If you go on the website of all 3 configurations, it does detail the inclusive parts. There is mention on there of the SATA adapter, something I'll talk about later on. But again, because this is the first time I'm opening this up for you guys, let's take a little look and see what we actually get for our bunts there. So we'll get that out of there. We've got our snazzy external box there. Definitely doesn't look like the Predator's face at all. And then we can have a little look what we get inside. I think a lot of users that are looking at this, by the way, are going to be people that may have played with a Raspberry Pi, currently version 4. I think version 5 is hopefully going to arrive this year of the Raspberry Pi. And that one of the big differences between that, the Raspberry Pi platform, and this, above and beyond, energy efficiency and, compact nature, is of course this is running on an Intel x86 platform, and predominantly Raspberry Pi is always arriving on ARM-powered CPUs there, which is a tremendous degree of capability difference between the two of them there. But inside we've got a quick start installation guide and information about setting the device up for the first time. Apparently it does run straight out of the box. First time boot will appear on the network apparently, but we'll double check that later on in the video. with the OS included. We have got a couple of stickers. Again, I've never been one for the stickers, but I know there are people out there that like that. IS and Zimaboard itself. Also, yes, inside we have got our SATA cable there included inside. And now this is something that really intrigued me. And I'm going to pop that just to one side there because I'm looking forward to talking about that SATA cable later. But I'm quite chuffed that's included with our initial presentation kit here. I should say, this is, again, the 199 model of this device. And straight away, I am absolutely loving it. I knew what it was going to look like. Obviously, I've seen lots of images when I was going through the PDFs for this review. But I'm still kind of blown away by the size. To put that into a bit of perspective, there is my Google Pixel 6 Pro. That is the difference in between them in terms of overall coverage. Obviously, it's a little taller with that heatsink there. And again, silent, no active fan inside there. It's totally, temperature controlled by heat dissipation on that initial plate there on the top and a series of heat dissipating pads throughout. I will also say, compared with that phone weighs at 210 grams. This device comes in at 280 grams. That's a little over a quarter of a kilo there for a system that can do arguably more in some cases than some 1 or 2 bay NASes from Synology and QNAP there. This is the TS133, knocking around for about 120, 130 nicker. That is the DS220J, knocking around for about 180 to 200 nicker. And even their 1 bay, the DS120J. Now, 1 bay NAS drives there, that arrives around about that 110, 120 nicker price point there. So this arriving at 119 to 199, depending on the 3 configurations, already puts it at a huge advantage for the kind of hardware you're getting inside this. I'm not going to call it groundbreaking hardware. More on that later on. But overall, I'd say for the price point, the kit is a little bit underwhelming there, but I didn't really expect it to be that crazy exciting. This isn't a device built around being highfalutin. It is designed, again, predominantly at those DIYers, at those hobbyists, but more on later on about how you can expand beyond that. For now, let's make our way over to the design. So first and foremost, when it comes to the design of this, we've got to talk about that heat dissipating plate there on the top. Both the best and arguably for some users, the worst thing about it. The best thing because obviously it means the lack of an internal fan being required there. Indeed, there are no moving parts inside this single board there. Not just a fan, but there are no optical drives inside, and the storage that is provided with it is just flash storage there on board. It does differ depending on the version you go for. Going by my notes here, you either get 16 or 32 gig of flash storage there, which is a little bit small, but more on that later on. But when I talk about that board being the best and the worst thing about it, that is when we start getting into that territory where we're moving slightly away from a kind of premium level product and going more towards those hobbyists, because that means you're going to have to make sure this thing is somewhere getting some ventilation. If you are going to install this inside a pre-existing case there, maybe you're going to use it with third-party software, you know, your pfSense, your OpenWRT, that sort of thing, or you're going to install it within an existing SATA cage to create a NAS system off the back of this within one larger unit. It means you're going to have to factor in active cooling around it the minute you encase it in something. This has been designed to work outside of any kind of enclosure there. And that lack of any active cooling on there means that when you do start factoring in a case, the minute you box it in like you might do with a Raspberry Pi in a modified case, that is when you're going to start to hit potential problems there. Now, another device we talked about when it came to portable, very small and easy to set up, customizable kind of router-based solutions is when we talked about this, the Beryl AX3000 last month, knocking around for about, what was it, $120, $130, depending on where you're shopping around. I think it was on promo and stuff somewhere. And that was a 2-port portable router which supported a bunch of different VPNs. It had that VPN switch there on the side, and it was pretty good for that purpose. And you could chuck on your own modified OpenWRT or any of that kind of modified open source. But with this, it arrives with software on board, which you can then scale up with other OSs there, because it's got that little flash storage there already built into it. Now, most of the actual hardware is in that base area, semi-translucent plastic plate there with a 2-sided PCB that we'll talk about later on in the hardware section. But that is pretty much going to be the place face down. Now, luckily, all of the key component chips on the top layer of this PCB underneath that giant heat dissipating panel there. All of the ports and connections there, obviously pre-soldered onto the internal PCB inside, all work there at the top end. But at the other end, we've got further ports all dotted around the case. And indeed, one of my other stylistic and, dare I say, user-friendly and incredibly innovative upgrades on this compared with the majority we've ever seen of little tiny playground mini server PC-based stuff. This thing's got a PCI slot there slammed on the side. They've even gone ahead and gone for an external protruding PCI port there. Why is that important? Because although it is Gen 2, more on that later on, it means if you go for a larger card, not only is it not cased in with a hook stopping you use full length x16 cards, which of course will be bottlenecked, but still nonetheless. But if you look very carefully, you can see on that groove of the PCIe, they've actually removed the cut. So there's no limitation in terms of length when it comes to using those longer than Gen 4 cards inside there. That's a really nice touch. They've accepted that there's going to be a bottleneck, at least internally in terms of bandwidth, but the physical restrictions there are virtually non-existent. I say virtually because, take for example, this Synology combo card here, and again, if we try to install that inside, what you find is that limitation there on the plate. This is not going to be able to be using plate covered cards there. Now, of course, you've got a port there. That's where our little display port there is. So we would have needed to remove that cover nonetheless. But still, it's quite a tight little fit there across. And it means if you're going to use a card, you're going to have to go for a card that has a hugely limited backplane there. Much like this card we'll talk about later on. If we get that card inside there, even then it's got that plate over the top. So you're going to have to get really, really small end enclosured kind of covered backplane to those PCIe cards because the protrusion's there. And of course, they're trying to maximize as much space as possible. They've needed that space for that. But just bear in mind that cards you put on this, most modern PCIe cards that arrive with, you know, full and half height profile brackets, you're probably going to have to run them with no profile bracket at all on this. So bear that in mind. Yes, if you're going to install an existing case that's modified, it wouldn't be a problem. But bear in mind, that's really the only problem I've got in terms of the way they've approached the design. They spent a lot of time building on this little card that, by the way, kind of looks like a Star Trek messaging. What was that thing called? I'll remember it before the end of the video. I'm sure someone in the comments is going to timestamp me and absolutely pwn me on that one. But I like the design of this. I like a lovely bit of ventilation there behind the card as well that goes all the way. I like the fact that the ports have been front and back, and I, of course, absolutely love the PCI upgradability of this. I think as a design choice, they've managed to factor in the most number of ports I've ever seen on a card like this, while still maintaining heat dissipation. And remember, knocking in at 280 grams with a full footprint of 13 centimeters by 8 by 3.4 centimeters. This thing's absolutely tiny. Tricorder. I got there in the end. Tricorder. But that's enough about that. Let's talk about a little bit more detail about those ports and connections. Now, the ports and connections on this thing are out of this world. But we have to at least keep our feet on the ground and acknowledge that because of the CPU architecture inside, there's still being x86, but definitely an older generation CPU that's being used inside. The result is that although the ports and connections are numerous, it's worth highlighting that they are not exactly bleeding edge 2023. Example, if we look at those ports there on the back, we've got a couple of Ethernet ports there, and again, depending on the software you use and the configuration, not just the CasaOS it arrives with, if you want to go for a third party, bear in mind they are both 1 GBE. Again, you can assign WAN LAN to your own configuration, but just bear in mind you're running on 1 gig. The same goes for those USB ports there. The USB ports are USB 3.2 Gen 1, so you've got your 5 gigabits per second each. There's no Gen 2 here. And if we look at the visual output there, they've not gone for an HDMI output there, presumably for power and spacing reasons. They've gone for that DisplayPort 1.2 DisplayPort there, mini display. So again, that's 60 frames per second, 4K top end. So a great output, but you're going to need to have an adapter if you want to run this as maybe a media server with direct output, or if you're going to interface with it to run a KVM or something on it, you're going to need that adapter. They do provide the adapter themselves. You can use their own for about $9 on their own site. I think it's like $9.50 or something like that for the DisplayPort 1.2 mini to an HDMI standard output adapter there. No power required, but you can pick up third-party ones pretty budget online for about 4 or 5 nicker, easy doors. I would say also with this device, if we look at the other side, we've got a couple of SATA connectors there. But you've got to bear in mind, those SATA connectors, that's exactly what they are. They're SATA. They're not combined SATA power. Now, they have worked around that. What they did, as I mentioned in the unboxing for this, they provide a single SATA and power connector to standard dual connection. So it means on the rear here, because you've got that power port there, which by the way provides enough power for 2 drives, and there is a dual version of this that's an optional extra, and that's only knocking around for about $3.80, $3.90 for the dual port version of this. They provided the 1 port included with the package, but that means if you want to go ahead and put the drive in, plug it there, put your power in, connect it, and put it in there. Actually look at what I'm doing, and then you have data power there at the end of your device. You can get there, your hard drive in, and from that point you've now got additional storage, not just that internal 1632. But again, we are talking, it's going to be on the table, it's going to be loose wire, so that's when you have to start thinking about the case, and of course you've got to think about that cooling. So I'm going to give you some idea about how much I love the connectivity on this, because that PCI port there is what sets this apart from a lot of, you know, mini PC motherboards or Raspberry Pis. That PCIe. The reason being that from that point, that is when you can take, for example, this is a 4-port M2 card here, and this is from a modified Acer Store video I was doing recently. You can go ahead, slot that in, and now we have got both a SATA hard drive bay there, but we've also got 4 M2 NVMe ports in there. Now bear in mind, this PCIe slot here, this is a Gen 2 times 4 port. So you've got 2,000 megabytes per second of bandwidth there to play with. So do bear in mind what you're putting inside there. If you go for a Gen 3, you're going to be throttled down to Gen 2, and then you're going to be heavily reliant on that times 4 there, so bear that in mind. But there are other modifications. If you want to go ahead, for example, a U2 adapter there, you can go ahead, slam that in, and now you've got a U2 drive adapter there, which you can also then run into dual port SATA drives that go in there for that. So again, lovely little modifier there. And then you've got to think about combo cards like the one we mentioned. Yes, we'd have to remove that adapter plate there at the top, but once you slot that in, you're now running an M2 NVMe and 10 GBE output within this single card here. Get a right case for that. You are absolutely cooking with gas. Just remember, you're going to have to remove that backplate in order to take advantage of it. But there are so many different kinds of adapter, whether you're going to go ahead with just a 10 GBE on its own, slam in 10G, you've now got your 2 1s and you've got a 10 GBE adapter there on top. There's a lot you can do, but then we haven't even factored in what you're going to do with those USBs. So for example, if you wanted to, slam in a USB to 2.5 GBE adapter, and you're cooking. Now you've got 2.5G and you've still got those little ones there. And there's even from StarTech that USB to 2 RJ45 card as well. So you don't even need to utilize the PCIe and get rid of it just to add more LAN ports. You can save that for maybe an expander box there for you to touch on for your multi-bay RAID enclosure running into it. And the thing that makes this the most interesting is because the CPU inside there, because it's an x86 rather than the traditional ARM that's found in Raspberry Pis. And again, we still don't have full confirmation on the Pi 5 when it rolls out, and we can only really go right now by the Pi 4. Because that is a Realtek and it's an ARM, it limits some of its capability. It doesn't make it a non-powerful CPU. A lot of those V8 ARMs that we're seeing rolling out now are fantastic. They are running containers like a dream. And the compatibility and the scalability and the way certain things like BTRFS have been modified to run them so well make them even better. But there's still no avoiding from a traditional PC stance that an x86 CPU will win the day more often than not. And this device giving you the ability to add 1 to 2 SATA-based hard drives there on the table. So you can go ahead and boom, you could have connected that drive. Then on top of that, you can go ahead and boom, add your 10 GBE to two to NVMe card. Boom, you've got that there. If you want, you've got, you know, your USB to 5G adapter. You've got USB to 2.5G adapter. You can go, if you choose, to add Wi-Fi 6 with a Wi-Fi 6 dongle. So all of a sudden, boom, now we've got a Wi-Fi 6 enabled 10 GBE M2 NVMe PC with our hard drive. We can use it as a NAS. We can use it for multiple OSs, but more on that later on about certain limitation. And all of that, all within this massive interface here, which we can gradually mod up as we go, then get our own modified case. This really is the sort of device that is bringing modified DIY PCs to a far more consumer and non-code background user that doesn't want to get thermal paste on the fingertips there. Now, it does have those limitations in terms of the design of how those cards go in, and indeed having this all laid out on a table is not great. You're going to have to get it inside a box or a case, and then got to think about that cooling. But for now, we're going to talk a little bit about that internal hardware some more. Now, the internal hardware of this device, as mentioned, running on that Intel is not a new chip. When we look at a lot of the Intels we're seeing in a lot of modern generation network attached storage devices, they are all rocking right now somewhere between the N5000 and the the J6000 series of both Celeron and Pentium processors. Indeed, when we are talking about the Topton and CWWK mini PCs from things like AliExpress, they're all rocking that N6000 or some of the J series Celeron and Pentium processors there. Now, this arrives with the N3450 CPU. It's a quad core with a pretty modest 1.1 gigahertz clock speed there. It does have integrated graphics between, looking at my notes there, 200 megahertz up to 700 megahertz when needed. And indeed, the clock speed of that CPU inside here, when it is running on burst when it's needed to, can go up to 2.2 gigahertz there quite easily. So you've got a moderate amount of hardware power, which, if you look at it two different ways, the negative way to look at that would be there are more powerful CPUs in the market right now within those product families. But another way to look at it is, at this price point, at somewhere between $100 to $200, you are getting a real great selection of hardware inside. And at this modest threshold and specifications, although that CPU means limitations in terms of, again, things like USB 3.2 and the PCIe lanes on this being Gen 2 instead of Gen 3, I'm sure there will be a follow-up version to this device down the line that's that more powerful. And there is our single board inside. CPU is there, as mentioned. This is not an active cooling system. It is directly thermal pasted onto this panel here with that tremendous cooling. It is solid as a rock there, still maintaining that weight point there at 280 grams. Another thing that's worth highlighting is, of course, the memory there at the top. Now, bringing that closer to camera, where my fingers are there are 4 individual low-power DDR4 modules there, LP chips. Now, this is the 8 gig model. The 2 gig model obviously only has the 2 chips, but it's not upgradable or changeable. So if you were thinking, woohoo, I'm going to crack me a little bit of Crucial sodium, you know, bang this bad boy up to 1632 gig, notwithstanding that CPU does have its own pre-existing CPU memory maximum handling bandwidth there. But on top of that, there is no sodium slot to go inside this. Again, those Raspberry Pi modders out there are going to be well familiar with that kind of thing. But still, it's a real shame that we can't scale up that memory accordingly, even if that CPU is a little bit modest by comparison. Now, also inside, we have got our storage there. A little bit of iNAND there at the bottom. On the bottom side there, we've got that thermal, we've got the CMOS battery there, and we've got temperature sensors as well. But the internal storage is between 16 and 32 gig. That is pretty small. Now, I get that they've got to remain within that price point, and almost certainly, given the cost of flash storage recently, particularly in 2022, 2023, that was probably one of the dividing factors to keep this within that price point. To put that into perspective, if you were to go ahead, and even if you chose to go M-SATA M2 NVMe, if you wanted to bump this up to 128 or 256 gig, it would have added the price on this another $30 to $50 because of the price of the NAND individually. And because they've got that scalability to add the additional SATA storage, to add USB storage, to add some kind of PCI connected SATA hard drive cage, I can see why they've done it, but there's no avoiding that that is a fairly modest amount of storage. Another thing worth highlighting, that because this arrives with that software that we're going to show you in a moment, CasaOS, which is a very nice bit of open source OS, I'll be straight with you, that software inside this lives on that storage. So if you want to go ahead and install internal storage based OSs, again, we're talking UPF-Sense, your Open WRT, we're talking DirectPlex or Open Media Vault and stuff like that, you're going to end up either having to wipe that storage or create some kind of partition, and you haven't got a lot to play with to start with. Now, if you want to go like unRAID, if you're going to go ahead and attach your JBOD or RAID-based cage of SATA storage there, or you're going to use a PCIe card like the ones I showed you that have got M2s and stuff like that, you'll be better off, because with unRAID, of course, that runs from the USB, which means although you're going to lose a USB, and remember, you can attach a docking station, you can add hubs and stuff like that, but you're still only going to have 500 megs to play with. It still means with things like unRAID, this is more than powerful enough to manage your unRAID, which is already very efficient as it goes. But if you're looking at things like TrueNAS, this is not going to cut mustard, because notwithstanding that CPU is fairly modest to start with, that 2 to 8 gig will hamper you somewhat with TrueNAS being a little bit greedy on the old memory to start with, and certain highfalutin TrueNAS services, even if it could run on the CPU comfortably. On 8 gig of memory, things like inline data deduplication, inline data compression, or compaction, they're not going to really run that well on 8 gig or at all in some cases. But getting all of that on a single board and then making the whole thing direct input output, lovely stuff. It's beautiful. But what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to get this put back together. We're going to get this set up, ready to roll, and we're going to take a little look at that software, because apparently this should work straight out of the box. We'll have to wait and see. Let's get it connected, get our PSU, get on the network, and log straight in to the OS now. Right, so here we are on the desktop of the CasaOS running on that Zimaboard. If we bring the camera just slightly up there, you can see I've got the device here on the table. I've got a drive attached there, I've got a USB device, I've got a PCIe card, and it's all running beautifully there off of the mains power outlet there. Now, straight away, we got to touch on, the CasaOS is included with this device, but frankly, I think a lot of you are going to be looking at this device to immediately change up that OS to other things. If you're looking at the network in there, of course, you've got your Open WRT, you've got your PF-Sense, and then at the same time there's a number of you that might be looking at some of the more OS open source friendly things out there for Open Media Vault for your multimedia users generally, to be able to package all your different kinds of media, be it multimedia or backups. And then you got your kind of semi-free stuff like unRAID, of course, which you can install with that USB. But I would say for an inclusive OS on a device that's knocking around for $100 or $200, this is actually pretty darn good. Now, if you are someone that likes the idea of containers and applications and stuff like that, I would say that this definitely takes away a lot of the complexity of installing containers in favor of its own app center. I'm not going to say this is a particularly well honed OS, though I will say it does feel very early and very light as an OS running on this system. I definitely think this, the Zimaboard is capable of bigger and better things. But I will say, as a default inclusive OS, there's a lot to like here. A lot of pre-made one-click install containers, such as Jellyfin here, which, again, you can go ahead and go into the Jellyfin application here, much like you would of any network-attached storage device, and click install if you choose there. Or just go ahead and click install within the window there, much like we're used to on a lot of different operating systems. Now, if you are someone more of a container-based user, then you do have the option, of course, to go ahead and create a customized application. Again, you can go ahead for the Docker application, find the identity there on the registry. You can build that container from the ground up if you choose. And having that flexibility of both ways is what I really like. It's going to, obviously there's a greater degree of abilities there. And again, if you've got an existing container already around that you want to go ahead and import into the device, that option's there. But I like the fact that you can choose either one. Remember, this is not a Realtek or an ARM type system here. We are still talking about an Intel x86 processor here in the mold, in the guise, in the presumed scalable deployment of a Raspberry Pi where you can pop it into an external casing there and be quite DIY, but it's definitely got a much softer edge to it than you find with things like Raspberry Pi. And now, when I mentioned about this OS, being good for the price, what I mean is CasaOS is nice enough, but I'm by no means going to call it a particularly evolved or developed operating system there. For example, there at the top, if you look at the customization options, they're very top layer. I wouldn't necessarily say this is going to be the most securest OS in terms of network connectivity there. I would definitely say opt for some of the other ones out there, but as a baseline OS, if you're not going to be enabling too much or any network external accessibility with those ports, there's a lot to like here. The OS, when I installed it, it had an immediate update there, and it seemed to be quite frequent, a lot of the updates that are ready and available on this system. Again, the customization, when you set it up for the first time, you immediately boot in. I used IP scanner and found the device on the network. I didn't have to KVM with an HDMI output or a keyboard or a mouse or anything. It was just directly on the network. I just had to make sure it was plugged into a switch that was going into the router there. I believe there in the background our Jellyfin installation has completed. And then I'm not seeing anything about multiple users. I do think this is a one-on, one-off system, but in that app center there are certainly a lot of applications that we're familiar with creating a multi-user environment in terms of storage and particularly network management. I mean, straight away off the bat, we've got a couple of different file managers. The one that you have native to the device, you can go ahead for managing your files there internally, and then includes if you want to add additional storage there, if you want to add those extended drives that I've connected, such as that hard drive, a 16 TB, or a little USB drive that I just slapped into one of those available ports. Same goes if you want to bolt on and synchronize with some of your cloud providers, and the same goes if you want to attach a NAS device there over SMB. You can do that, but you will of course need to have the credentials for that, and it's going to be network based, which on this device on 1 gigabit Ethernet, you're looking at 100 to 109 megs for remote access to another NAS there. But at least you can use this as a $200 additional storage layer, or at least storage management layer in terms of security. Now, in terms of security, you've got things like AdGuard and I think a couple of other VPN providers via the native OS and the App Center that you can go into there and use some of those other controlled means of managing your network, be it is for security purposes with things like AdGuard and Nextcloud, or going over to the Unify controller controlling or unifying Ubiquiti environment around you, as well as the ability to immediately add that Pi hole to kind of kill out all of those ads that are going into your home or business environment there with a lot of those services, all built in to that CasaOS. If you don't want to go ahead and install a brand new flashed OS on this, that pfSense, OpenWRT, that sort of thing, you can still use a lot of the CasaOS stuff to manage those with a lot of those pre-made one-click install containers, or go ahead with those custom installs that I mentioned earlier on. And there's actually quite a lot of flexibility there in terms of what you can and cannot install, and it's pretty clear, it's pretty open. They're giving you access to the hardware to do with what you will. Network status there, I did connect that Wi-Fi 6 dongle to this device and it didn't immediately see it. I don't know if that is a CasaOS limitation there built into Linux, but we'll have to wait and see. One assumes it is quite a specialized USB, so maybe a driver would be required, and therefore a more specialized container. Maybe in GitHub you can get the driver that's been modified from maybe like a Windows OS, or just the driver in general has been modified over, but I'd have to check for that. Widget settings there, not a lot to play with. Frankly, it's just a very light control of the OS there. This is definitely running very low end here in the browser. Not to make any direct comparisons to things like Synology and QNAP too much with QTS and DSM, and they're a huge operating system, like comparable to the likes of Windows sometimes in their capabilities. This is not that. This is very comparable to that of early mobiles and Android and such. It's very responsive, very quick, but I'm not going to say it's the deepest. There's not many layers deeper than what you're seeing here on screen. When it comes to multimedia, they're all here. You've got your Jellyfin, you've got your Plex, you've got your MB, and again, we could go through the installation. It's all very familiar. We've done it here on the channel. And I like that if you want to create a very quick Plex Media server there, or again, MB and Jellyfin supported, You've got it here with that $100 to $200 spend there, connecting it with an external SATA drive once again, or using a USB drive, or using a PCIe bridge card for that additional storage there. There's a lot to do and a lot of flexibility available to you in this software. The reason I talk about security on this is the fact that I could turn it on and access it, and it kind of, using some of these software applications included, I can open up. But because these are pre-made container installs, there is that question mark sometimes about their security rather than developing your own when you're not using a particularly robust and proficient OS that it's living within to manage that security safely there. That's what I mean about the software maybe not being the most evolved, but still very, very good for the price point you're getting there. And although it is only a handful of applications in the ready-made one-click install area here that have been developed within utilization in CasaOS, there is still a tremendous amount of opportunity to scale up via the GitHub, the Docker options there, all the way through. So overall, in terms of software, it isn't going to be the highlight of the Zimaboard, but I will say what you are getting for that price point is still pretty darn good. And if you do want to go in on the command line level, you want to step out of the squishy, easy, crayon-friendly interface there, you can go ahead and terminal in quite successfully. But how much you use that is up to you. Overall, I like it. It's not going to blow me away. It's not going to blow you away. But as an inclusive extra, this is almost like a fantastic freebie on a device that a lot of users within 6 to 12 months are going to be absolutely flashing that software. But still a great inclusion. Let's summarize today's review with the conclusion. So what do I think? Well, I think it's fairly obvious what I think. I chuffing love this thing. I think genuinely when it comes to this emerging middle ground that I keep talking about here on the channel over and over again, this is a beauty of an example that is bringing a lot of that DIY modern mentality to a lot of users out there that may think looking at code, looking at things like Docker, looking at a lot more of the Codey based stuff and just going, oh my God, I do not have time for that. And this is where these beautiful examples like this are bringing a lot more, arguably more complex technology to the forefront of more soft consumer utilization there. Now, it ain't perfect. It is definitely only a few rungs above a hobbyist device. I do not believe that this can challenge this. I do not think, in terms of the big NASes, the 4, the 6, the 8 bays out there, this challenges that. But I don't think it's supposed to. I think this challenges the complexity of Raspberry Pi for a lot of novice users. It definitely challenges 1 and 2 bay NAS devices knocking around with an OS on board that you may not want to use. And it definitely allows a lot more DIY kind of prohibited users to get on board with more customized solutions, and definitely solutions better catered to their own personal setup without it being overtly complex. I'm not going to say it's not complex. It certainly has a steeper learning curve than a lot of these NAS devices next to me here, but it's not as steep as it used to be, and you have a lot more control over the complexity of your setup there without going full DIY or running the risk of purchasing from, again, your AliExpresses and more, where you are buying something where you feel like the return policy is non-existent, where you feel that if something does arrive and it is broken to hell, you've got no means as a consumer to return. This, going through that Kickstarter with public opinion, monitoring it there, and arguably successfully making it through it, makes it a hugely appealing device there. But as I mentioned, it is not perfect. The lack of that CPU being even a little bit more powerful, I think it could have been maybe that J4000 series CPU or even some of the N4s, and it would have increased the price maybe $10 to $12. But of course, this is a device that's been rolling on for a while when we're looking at modern eyes. Next up, I don't like that I can't scale up that memory. I get it's probably a limitation of the CPU anyway, but because that CPU, and you get to the lower end model at 119 are only arriving with 2 gig of memory, I think 2 gigs a bit mean, even for a device of this stature like this one. The same goes for the non-upgradability of being able to upgrade the storage internally. Even if you didn't go M2 NVMe, I think you could have gone ahead with a single external SATA and maybe factored in an internal mSATA port there. Even if mSATA is slowly dying out to NVMe, I think it would have been maybe possible. And there is the lack of USB-C, something I didn't really talk about in the video, but there's a lot of docking stations, be they USB 3.2 Gen 1 or Gen 2, that arrive with USB Type-C and things like this. An external M2 SATA and NVMe adapter from Arico that only has USB Type-C. Yes, you can get USB-A to C adapters, but I think with so many devices arriving with C on board, I think it's a little bit short-sighted that one of these isn't a C straight off the bat, even if it is old Gen C. But overall, I really, really like this, and I'm definitely integrating this into my own personal setup there, alongside the little Beryl AX3000 there. I have my own selection of devices, and I'm very pleased to say this is very much going to make a lovely little home there. Maybe as something of a little Unraid modding kit there, maybe as something of an emulation station there for a lot of my online gaming, for my online ROMs through RetroArch or using LibreArch. One way or another, this has a lot of capability and a lot of scalability, and is a little bit more approachable than a lot of the DIY ground up build options out there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If this video does well, I might do a few more follow-up videos on this in my own personal setup, as well as a before you buy, where we completely centralise a lot of the points we covered today. But thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed it. Of course, subscribe if you want to learn more. If you need help with your own personal setup, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares in the free community forum. Genuinely free. Will help anyone. It might take us an extra day or two to answer your email, but they're all there. We do help as much as we can. And if you found this video helpful, and if you were going to shop at Amazon or buy this directly from the website themselves directly, and only if that's true, if we've helped you and you've enjoyed the video, use the links in the description to take you there. The result is that anything you buy via those links results in a small kickback here to me and Eddie. It's only just us two at NAS Compares, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. The videos, the articles, the free advice. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.